All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to hear David Hume, Liberal Political Theory. This is based on a paper with Erik Matson called Mere Liberty in David Hume, which is appearing in a companion to David Hume published by the University Francisco Mariquim in Guatemala, edited by Morris Polanco. This is the image from the Adam Smith companion. I believe it's going to look the same way. And I'm going to use some slides that relate to some of my other videos, and I'll move through those especially quickly to this group that might be familiar. James Madison said that among the difficulties encountered by the Constitutional Convention, and a very important one, must have lain in combining the requisite stability and energy in government with the inviolable attention due to liberty and to the Republican form. I like the way he breaks these three things out. We'll come back to that. So Erik and I are focusing on others not messing with one's stuff as mere liberty and contending that this is central in Hume. And when we say others not messing, in particular the government not messing with one's stuff. Now this immediately raises paradoxes. Hume said a great sacrifice of liberty must necessarily be made in every government, and that liberty is the perfection of civil society, but authority must be acknowledged essential to its very existence. So there's an obvious paradox with authority, government, and then liberty. And he's very aware of this paradox. He talks of liberty very pervasively, in fact, over 700 times in the 6-volume history alone. He often uses these other modifiers here. Which of these might correspond to mere liberty, as we're calling it, is an interesting question. We don't hope to sort that out exactly, but we're suggesting that it's in there. Let me say that from doing this study on Hume, these are things I learned, and so maybe things that you'll find especially pertinent. First, the standing of mere liberty in Hume and the role of natural jurisprudence in liberal political theory. The importance of jural integration in liberal political theory and the aspiration of a liberal nation state. Something I'm going to call the jural logic of one's own, and more broadly, the arc and character of liberalism 1.0. Going back now to historical context, the grand sweep, let's just think about the printing press, that giving rise to the opportunity of people writing out, trying to publish and distribute their interpretation of things, really for the first time, interpretation of the world, of scripture, of morality. And so we get people trying to do that and hoping to put across their whole interpretation of things. We get innovation and secession in religion. This leads to wars of religion, fighting over the ring of power, if you will. From that arise, gee, folks, maybe religious toleration is a good idea, even liberty of religion. Meanwhile, this is all a period of the rise of the nation state. So all this is in that broad context. This is the arc. In a sense, I think it's wise to pick up from the printing press. This Arthur Melzer quote talks about how before, when we had traditional society, government very much led and tended the higher things that were sacred, that were meaningful to people, that made communities cohere, and so on. And then through these centuries of conflict and now different and conflicting interpretations of things, the transition to having government focus, instead of on the higher things, on the lower things, to safeguard those, sort those out, try to create operating systems such that people could then move forward in their own ways in pursuit of the higher things. So a shift here in traditional society from the higher to the more modern, a focus on the lower. And part of that focus on the lower is clarifying these rights and duties, dividing and subdividing those. This was very much the work of the natural jurisprudence writers, creating again a kind of basic operating system, which then emerges as the liberal plan in Adam Smith. As Pocock put it, the child of jurisprudence then is liberalism. And Dugald Stewart said the systems of natural jurisprudence were the first rudiments of liberal politics taught in modern times. Now, a little bit of genealogy, another way to look at it. We've got our natural jurisprudence writers, some of them there, and then political stability comes in Britain really at the beginning of Hume's life. Hume is very much the same as Smith, in my view, and Smith brings forward this word as the word for his plan, his system, as he puts it in The Wealth of Nations. And so by extending this word backward, we can think of these earlier folks as proto-liberals. I feel quite comfortable just talking about Hume as liberal since he's so close to Smith, even though it comes, the liberal word comes to have that original political meaning only in the 1770s. So getting back to the whole Hume issue and what Erik and I are putting across here. First of all, let me say that some scholars, I think, are kind of very much in the vein of what we're saying here, even if they don't focus on this mere liberty as much as we do. Others, however, are shy on mere liberty, and they talk about what liberty means in Hume, and they really don't focus in on this mere liberty, others not messing with your stuff idea as much as, in some sense, we think they miss it. That's really the point of the paper as far as Hume scholarship goes. That a lot of the prominent Hume scholars haven't, in a sense, done justice to mere liberty in Hume. Talking in more general terms about things like general and inflexible laws. That's Hayek's words, in fact. Hayek even went kind of light on mere liberty throughout most of his writings in these connections. The absence of arbitrary coercion. Laws must be known, regular, predictable. The rule of law. Conventions of authority. This is the kind of more general language, and you don't get that same kind of robust liberty idea when you read so much of the Hume scholarship. So that's kind of what we're motivated by. Make a parallel to the term transportation. Is a car transportation? Well, those cars don't look very transporting at the moment. I think more essentially, transportation is moving things from one place to another, kind of the essential meaning. And then you can think of contributory meanings, things that contribute to moving things from one place to another. And now a car becomes transportation, as we very naturally might speak of cars. And in the same way, we're suggesting that this is the essential meaning of liberty, and then there are a lot of contributory meanings, things that contribute to others, not messing with one's stuff. So to go back to James Madison, we see the essential meaning here, and then it's surrounded by the institutions and pillars and structures of contributory meanings, you see? And I think this thing that we're doing with identifying mere liberty is not just Hume. It's this whole liberal arc, it's the American founding, and so on, even though, I don't think things are always parsed out as or made as explicit as we're doing here. So Hume's Constitution of Liberty has these pillars and institutions of government and so on, predictable rules, the Republican element, habeas corpus, all sorts of things you can identify. But at the heart, there's this essential meaning, others not messing with one's stuff. So there's this polysemy, meaning polysemantics of the word liberty. That's what we're looking at in this paper. This approach to Hume and to Smith is one we've learned to take on a lot of their important words, of course, okay? So this liberty, others not messing with one's stuff, is the flip side of not messing with other people's stuff, and that brings us back to what's in a sense more rudimentary commutative justice, the duties, the natural jurisprudence. And Hume treats this really well in the treatise, and he uses language of abstaining, which is in the famous expression for commutative justice, abstaining from what is another's. That appears in the theory of moral sentiments, but that expression goes back earlier than Adam Smith. And so step one is to see that this is very much in the treatise, this talk of abstaining, used just this way. It or its cognates are used 9 times, as in this example here. Some related expressions are excluding others, that, you know, the other people from your stuff being fenced against every mortal in every possible case. So this is that classical expression, classical meaning, you know, early modern period expression, abstaining from what is another's. I prefer this formulation of not messing with other people's stuff, the duty of not messing with other people's stuff, because I think it parses out a little more nicely. It lends itself to analysis a little better, but you can see that they are very equivalent. So this formulation invites us to think about how these things are defined in context, historical context. What is stuff? What is property or something owed by contract? We know that that changes over time and historical context. What makes it one person's rather than another person's? Whose property is it? Or is it perhaps nobody's? It's an unowned resource. And what counts as messing with it, right? So these are sorted out in historical context or emerge within historical context, but there's a uniformity in this general formulation. So there's uniformity amidst the historical and geographic variety, and government in that variety plays a role in defining these specifics in context. So this is Smith's famous statement of commutative justice, saying that the most sacred laws of it guard the life and person, property and possessions, promises due. Okay? And we see this in in Hume. And let's start with person and person, self-ownership. This has been not so recognized in Hume, but it's there. He doesn't make a big deal of it for some reason, maybe because he somehow wants to think of himself as moving beyond Locke and different than Locke. I'm not really sure why, but it is there. And particularly in this passage in the treatise, there are 3 different species of goods which we are possessed of. 1, the internal satisfaction of our minds. 2, the external advantages of our bodies. That's our person, those 2. And then 3, such possessions as we have acquired. And so then he says, men must seek for a remedy by putting the 3rd category here, these possessions, on the same footing with the fixed and constant advantages of the mind and body. So he's actually seeing self-ownership as sort of the most natural property, actually to use a term that David Friedman uses in his excellent 1994 paper on natural property. And then sort of by extension, we think about how these things come to be thought of as our property. Okay, to be put on the same footing. And we do this by a convention, he says here. And you see him speaking at times in this self-ownership way, like when he says the most considerable of all goods, life and limb. He sometimes speaks of natural or native liberty when he seems to be speaking of self-ownership. He says the English government's obligation is to secure everyone's life. And this self-ownership idea you could read into, I think, quite directly when he speaks of captives or prisoners recovering their liberty. Similarly, the liberty of thought, conscience, religion, liberty of press and speech. These are all just the 6 volumes of the history citations. And then that idea of ownership of these things' property actually naturally extends outward as as human society evolves. We learn more and more how to propertize things. Things that would never have been propertized or regarded as property in a primordial state of human existence, the natural state, by which in this case he means a sort of an original primordial state. So we develop those conventions. And then similarly for contract. And he speaks of how we use signs and words to make new focal points defining contract and new terms of our own. Promises due us now, okay? And he says that these CJ conventions emerge in such a way that they do not admit of degrees. They have this precise and accurate nature that Smith then talks about. And it's precisely for these features, realize, that those conventions are selected as the terms of property and contract, of commutative justice. They are selected for that precision of accuracy because they give a grammar to social life. And that's Smith's analogy, grammar. Hume didn't have the grammar analogy. So Hume sees the world in terms of mutual coordination in an unbelievably brilliant way, very much anticipating these 20th century figures, understanding the idea of focal points, and in a sense, seeing everything as focal points all the way down, even human consciousness. When you really get your Hume right, you start to have those disturbing thoughts. And of course, he sees things like language and so on evolving as convention as defined by David Lewis. And this convention then, in the Lewis-Hume definition, is broader than contract. Like if you and I make a contract or do something by our consent, you could say that those now form new conventions that are contractual, but they are within a wider world of convention, which is not by a matter of contract. This emerges as a natural convention in the sense that for any community to get on in the world and survive, such rules of not messing with each other's stuff have to be reasonably respected among equals. So commutative justice is a set of conventions, and these conventions are in here, not here. It's not as though we once made a promise to mankind. We will not mess with other people's stuff, you see. It's all part of a background convention, the world of convention, which actually creates human consciousness, you could say. Similarly, we don't make a promise to humankind. I promise to keep my promises to John, right? It's just a convention of justice that we are raised and learn to follow, to even feel an allegiance to. And then he said that political authority is likewise here, not here, right? Attacking social contract theory or contractarianism. And again, it's with this whole conventionalist background that you need to think about him seeing liberty as this sort of goal of the improvement of liberty of civil society. So Hume and Smith go full conventionalist on the two major issues, property, political authority, as far as do they invoke contract, consent, compact, contractarianism, you might say. And that's quite different than these earlier guys in the world of unstable politics who actually did invoke these things, I think perhaps to give authority to what they were trying to get to settle down and to make stable. Locke is interesting because he goes no here and yes here. So anyway, back to Hume. So this whole idea, this whole basis of in commutative justice, the natural jurisprudence idea, the duties side of it, that's here. But then he does the flip, and you get the flip side, the rights side of it, to liberty. So you see actually the flip happening in the treatise here, and using the word liberty. And in fact, he says that once these conventions for property and such are established, there remains little or nothing to be done towards settling a perfect harmony and concord. So right in the treatise, you get this expression of a kind of a liberal political outlook. Like if we could get this stuff settled and then just do the flip side to liberty and make that kind of the centerpiece of things, there remains little or nothing to be done towards settling a perfect harmony and contract. Because the treatise is not like about what good politics is, but you see expressions like that within it nonetheless. I want to quote Hawkinson just because he's so important. For Hume, the object of just laws is thus individual liberty. And since the most obvious and most endangered expression of such liberty is the acquisition and use of property, justice is centrally concerned with property, and it follows with contract. So, I just want to recruit Hawkinson to this idea that this mere liberty is really central in Hume. So we're concerned about the government now messing with this stuff. When is it a messing? Okay, this gets to the question of pinning down what's a messing and what's not. And again, I want to remind you that political stability only came really up until about this time. It didn't come like all together with the Glorious Revolution. But this political stability is really important to keep in mind because it is something that's sort of presupposed in their political thought, Hume and Smith's. And you got to realize also that they're like new to this. They're like the founding fathers of the new liberal political outlook that can presuppose political stability. And this brings us to the matter of jural integration. To us here today, we so naturally speak of the government, as though it is like a unified thing, an integration of all the different levels of government, and that's because it basically is, and it's what we kind of take for granted, and the way it's been, and I hope remains. We live in this world of stable polity, so much so that we kind of forget how important that might be in understanding the whole arc of liberalism. In a stable polity, then, you've got the integrated jural superior, all these together, and then that creates two types of jural relationships. There are those, the governed, who have relationships with each other, neighbor to neighbor, worker to worker, and so on. Okay, equal jural relationships, and then the relationship between the jural superior and inferior, governor-governed jural relationships. So we got jural integration, which results in this jural dualism. Here's the logic, this jural logic of one's own. For such societies, a type of action in superior-inferior jural relationship is an initiation of coercion and hence a treading on liberty, if and only if such action is an initiation of coercion in EE, okay? So, we understand these things to be an initiation of coercion, and we can see that, this, if your neighbor tried this on you here, it would be this. If your neighbor tried this, it would be that. If your neighbor tried this, it would be that. So yes, these are all initiations of coercion. And this is sort of this is how the jural logic pins down when the government is messing with your stuff, because we test it against, well, if our neighbor tried that, would we regard it as such? And that is all answered, asked and answered in a historical context, right? Now, municipal laws, again, he says, may fix the principles of human nature, what has been left undetermined, so it can, again, partly determine where those different points of grammar operate in context, but this historicity pins down the elements of commutative justice here, giving us operative ideas of justice and its flip side, liberty. And so we get a general formulation pervading all such societies. But these societies are the jurally integrated ones, okay? And then we can start talking about the liberal plan. But now I want to go back in history, and that's part of the point of Hume's 6-volume work. We got to remember it wasn't always this way, right? And there was jural pluralism. That's the word I'm using for something that is not integrated and hence creates more than jural dualism. And what it creates is a mess. You've got all these different power structures, all these different sources of authority, of power, of force, and so on. You know, a different kind of world than we know. And it's almost hard for us to imagine, really, and to even think about what our words would mean in that. And a lot of these are quite important for the English story, the British story. The family, the clans, like the Highlander clans, that's important. Master-slave relationships, very important in this continent. We, the children of British civilization, a huge problem. You know, slave masters or slave owners talking about their property and the sacredness of their property, right? How do we parse that? Well, I know how to parse it, but it's a tough sell because of this jural pluralism. And then very important here is this, which we're going to dwell on a bit in the history. Also, these might have their own mechanisms of enforcement and force. You know, multiple leaders or rulers contending, even rebellions in the 18th century. I think the guilds and corporations may have, to some extent, had their own means of force, actually. There's the issue of secessionism, like what is legitimate for a part to break away, the idea of possible foreign allegiances within the realm. Okay, so you've got a mess. And a big part of the history is the story of, or marking moments of this jural integration and stable polity. And earlier on, he said, in the ancient feudal constitution, there was a mixture, not of authority and liberty, which we have since enjoyed in this island, and which now subsists uniformly together, but of authority and anarchy. And so in that older period, when the prince wanted the cooperation of the barons, the question was decided with arms in the field, not by debates or arguments in a senate or assembly. In the pre-Tudor period, that required authority almost absolute to pull down those disorderly and licentious tyrants. This would be the barons and lords, who were equally averse from peace and from freedom, and to establish that regular execution of laws. This was the sovereign's job, which in the following age enabled the people to erect a regular and equitable plan of liberty. In his excellent book on Hume's politics, he says that in the feudal era, England's barons did not support the rule of law because in its absence, they themselves were law. Civilization was a matter of bringing the barons, through a mix of force and bribery, to believe that great wealth and status among fellow subjects under equal laws was more desirable than a lawless and miserable domination. And thus the barons became gentlemen. This is a big part of the transition of the story, is the barons becoming gentlemen, as it were, people who are now subdued and integrated into the jural integrated state we hope, the liberal nation state. And then Hume appeals to these new formed guys, the honest gentleman that he kind of addresses himself to sometimes in his work. And so broadly speaking, you've got this kind of historical movement here from jural pluralism to jural integration, the governor and the governed, okay? A little bit more from Hume's history. He says, a civilized nation like the English, who have happily established the most perfect and most accurate system of liberty that was ever found compatible with government. You know, it's not totally compatible, but you try to square the circle. Ought to be cautious in appealing to the practice of their ancestors or regarding the maxims of uncultivated ages as certain rules for their present condition. So in this jural pluralistic world, we have this fog of jural ideas. And we don't really know even what liberty means there because we can't apply that simple logic, that jural logic of one's own that I put up, because we don't even necessarily have this clearly defined. It may not even make sense to speak of a system of equal relationships when there's all these different powers and layers, cross-cutting forces, and so on. You can't apply that logic, so you're not even sure what liberty means. Okay? And furthermore, inasmuch as it does mean something in that setting, it's very probable that the powers are very much going to leave it on the back burner because they've got, you know, more pressing matters to consider. They're like at war with each other, they're unstable, and so on. So liberty is very much a secondary consideration. So I see these guys as convention-savvy civilizational leaders building on the anticipations of these guys, for example, who could not presuppose stable, integrated polity. And so again, there's all this stuff, the contributory stuff, sort of surrounding and in some sense aim towards promoting this thing in the middle. And he definitely sees this as late distillation, Hume. Duncan Forbes, in his important work on Hume's politics, in fact says that you really can't knock, and Hume was saying, you really can't knock the Stuarts, or at least the first two, for destroying liberty, attacking liberty, because they could hardly be blamed for trying to destroy something which did not then exist. People were too much reading their present into the past of James I and Charles I when that was kind of inappropriate. And so he was perceived, Hume, as being overly sympathetic to those guys, seeing them as more reasonable than a lot of their critics said. And in the history then what we see is Hume basically endorsing the integrative work of divine right monarchy and other centralized forces like that, but then glad of how it was reconstituted in fitful succession by opinion associated with such things as print culture, commerce, and not least the Puritan element, the Reformed church element. And talk of mere liberty is quite copious. We provide a whole bunch of quotations where I think we see this meaning in his liberty talk. It also is in other related talk, which I think is only really cogently interpreted in mere liberty terms. So I think there's plenty of textual evidence. Once we can presuppose this stable polity, it's quite clear that Hume favors a presumption of liberty, generally leans in favor of liberalization, free enterprise, degovernmentalization of social affairs, etc., if we can presuppose those things. So Hume, you might say, is a conservative, as is sometimes perceived and called a conservative, because in his context he so much favored the political establishment, the stable polity that had emerged. Very much so. I think he was really celebrating that. and trying to secure that as much as possible, and did see it, as always, in danger. And he was worried by developments, particularly in the 1760s and 1770s when he died in 1776. So he's kind of a conservative, and you might say he's an establishment political philosopher, to use Duncan Forbes' term. But as Erik points out in some of his work, it's not proper to see him as an establishment political economist, in the sense that, okay, within that Constitution of Liberty, now we're doing policy making and public discourse about policy debate, and what should we do about this, the policy, that policy. And here, he doesn't at all, strongly oppose reform. In fact, he generally favors reform in the liberal direction, and because it's in the liberal direction, because he sustains this presumption of liberty, I think it's proper to call him liberal. So he's both, in a sense, conservative and liberal. And this kind of interpretation of these fellows, I think, is in the spirit of some of these authors, among many others. So some scholars have been shy on seeing this mere liberty in Hume. That was really the main impetus to all this. Some have even disputed the drift of our paper and presentation. So it's kind of an open debate. But in my view, these two guys best represent classical liberalism. This raises the question, why the unclarity? That's a big, good question, and I don't have a quick, short answer. I do think that the paradoxes might suggest that you don't want to necessarily be too clear about what's all involved here. It may not be healthy for the state and for society to emphasize that the government is basically an institution of initiating coercion. For example, that also may not fly well with a lot of your surrounding authorities and readers and so forth. It can also be abused. You get people pounding the fist too much then for liberty in an unreasonable way, a man of system kind of way. And also there are taboos around these matters. People may not like to admit that the government is violating liberty and want to talk about things in those terms. So I think there are answers to this question. Tom Merrill, our friend at American University, says that Hume's model is Socrates rather than Newton. That is, his idea is not to spoon feed us about all the difficult philosophical questions and philosophical issues. It's more Socratic, leading us along, creating these contrarieties, and so on. And so this is Simba looking up at the spirit of Mufasa, right, his dad, who says to him, look inside yourself, you are more than what you have become, remember who you are. And I put this up here because this is a story of the liberal project, the liberal projection, and I think we need to remember who we are. And the liberal project has, been faring perhaps not that well. It's always, I think, being discussed. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what it's all about. But I think it's good advice from Mufasa here. Remember who you are. So let's do what we can. Thank you very much for your attention. Great.